Hello, and welcome to our week 9 of our Toolbox webinar series. Today, we are starting our new module on emotion regulation. So we're going to be talking today about functions of emotions and as well how to describe emotions. So what we do, this webinar series is being put on by Youth Eastside Services. We are the leading behavioral health provider for children and youth ages birth through 22. And we serve primarily folks who are on the east side in King County. We provide youth and family mental health counseling. We also do substance use and co-occurring disorder counseling. And then as well, Delaney and I are from the community education and prevention program. So we are school-based folks, and you might see us in your communities. If you would like to reach out to us, we are currently closed to new clients, but you are always welcome to look at our website to find more information or check back in to see when we might be taking new clients. Our website is up on this slide as well as our phone number, and you are always welcome to join us on social media and follow us to see what kinds of things we're up to. If you would like to reach out to someone else, I have the crisis line numbers that are pretty local on here. This is not quite those crises that really reached the need for 911, but they are something that you would like to talk about with something immediately. So you are always welcome to call those 24/7 numbers, the King County Crisis Line, or text the crisis text line. Both of those numbers are on the slide. And as well for our younger audience, those teens who might be listening, contacting Teen Link from 6 to 10 p.m. every single night of the year is also an option for you. My name is Kaylin Griffith. I'm a behavioral health support specialist. I'm a licensed mental health counselor, associate, and substance use disorder trainee. Delaney is muted.
I know it popped up and was like, you're muted. And my name's Delaney Not Nearest. I'm the school-based behavioral health coordinator. I'm a social worker by training and also a drug and alcohol counselor as well. It's so funny, the world that we live in. And oh yeah, I'm muted. Wow.
We are taking all of our materials from this webinar series from the DBT Skills in Schools textbook, as well as the DBT Skills Training Manual. If anything that we are talking about sparks inspiration or sounds really, really cool and you'd like to learn more on your own, or as we've been talking about the last several weeks, we do skip some of the skills that are in these workbooks and in like the larger curriculums. So if you're like, hey, I really love this DBT thing and want to find out more, go ahead and find one of these materials to read more.
All right, so today's agenda, we are going to start off with mindfulness like we normally do, just trying to get into the habit and the practice of that. We're starting again, like Kaylin said, our new unit, which is emotion regulation. And the two skills we're going to learn today are functions of emotions and describing emotions. We will then, of course, wrap up with some at-home practice. If you are following along after the fact and watching the recording, make sure that you go to the YES website where you registered for this or found the video and download the handout. We always like to give you at-home practice, and that handout also has that for you so that you can walk through it on your own, as well as keep notes on our presentations as we go through them, just a little helpful tool. And if we do have anyone join us live, we will also do a Q&A at the end. And like Kaylin said, this is week 9 of 16. All right. So of the skills that we've learned so far, so we've gone through 2 units. We've done mindfulness, and those are all the skills we've learned in mindfulness. We've also just finished up distress tolerance and all of those skills there. So now we are starting emotion regulation, and the first 2 are functions of emotions and describing emotions. So if you missed any of our previous skills that we've taught, definitely go back and check out the recordings of those. They're meant to be helpful and useful, and you don't necessarily have to do this in sequence, but it is helpful if you see something on there and you're like, oh yeah, because we do reference other skills. The skills kind of build off of each other, and you can also use them one at a time as well. So we are going to do our mindfulness activity. Kaylin, if you want to stop sharing, great, perfect. And I will share, try to share audio. And this is just also another person talking about kind of what we're going to talk about today. So it's sometimes nice to hear other folks talking about it instead of us all the time. But hopefully this will be a useful activity or video for us all to watch.
Mindfulness of current emotions is a skill to decrease emotional suffering by allowing yourself to just experience an emotion in the present moment. When difficult or intense emotions arise, we often try to change, reject, or block them because they're so painful. Sometimes this works, but lots of times it doesn't. Mindfulness of current emotions is a way of experiencing your emotions without necessarily acting on them in order to learn you can experience them without falling apart. With practice, you will feel more in control of your emotions instead of feeling like your emotions control you. Start by noticing and observing your emotion. See if you can experience your emotion as a wave, coming and going. Imagine surfing this emotion wave. At times, it will come to a peak and then will subside. This is hard to remember when you're in the middle of an unpleasant emotion, but no emotion lasts forever. And actually, the duration of an emotion is much shorter when you just acknowledge its presence, instead of intensifying it or keeping it around by thinking about all the things that made you sad or all the reasons another person has made you angry. Don't try to get rid of the emotion. Don't try to keep it around either. Be willing to experience the emotion just as it is, like a wave. One way to stay in the present and practice this skill is by focusing on the physical sensations that you're experiencing. This step involves noticing where in your body you're feeling emotional sensations and experiencing them as fully as you can. It helps here to be curious. Do you feel tension in your forehead? Are your fists clenched? Is there a feeling of emptiness in your stomach or a lump in your throat? Do you notice tears in your eyes or pressure in your chest? You may notice quick, shallow breaths. You may notice your heart racing. These are the kinds of sensations you want to observe. See if you can notice any subtle changes in these sensations as you pay attention to them, or notice how long it takes before the sensations change. As you continue to observe your emotion, remember that you are not your emotion. You don't have to act on it. There is no emotion you haven't experienced before. There is no emotion that has lasted forever. It can also help to remind yourself that there were times when you felt differently. Part of this skill involves respecting and loving your emotion. This might sound ridiculous or too hard at first. Loving something is the opposite of fighting it. By letting go of judging or rejecting your emotion, you are closer to accepting it, which will help you let go of emotional suffering. Perhaps you can start by noticing how this emotion makes sense, or telling yourself it's okay to feel this emotion right now. Remember, for this skill, observe your emotion by experiencing it as a wave coming and going. With curiosity, notice physical sensations in your body. Finally, practice loving your emotion.
I feel like that was super relevant to this week's lesson, actually.
I know. And it also goes back to a lot of skills we've already talked about, in terms of the describe and observe, and then also just being present. And one of the things that I think is always great to acknowledge about mindfulness in general, and specifically with this one, is it is hard and it does take practice and it is kind of awkward. Like, I appreciated that they called out that, loving your emotions is challenging. It's not something super simple that you can just do immediately, and it does take practice.
So we will probably be nodding back to that video several times throughout this presentation. And let's go ahead and just get started. My slides want to advance. There we go. So as we were saying before, we are starting a new module today. So we're starting emotion regulation. And really, emotion regulation is pretty easy to understand. It's right there in the name. The idea is that we want to take our emotions and have a little bit more control over them instead of the other way around. Again, that's kind of language that we've been using so far throughout this whole webinar series. And really what we're going to focus on today is understanding the emotions that you experience. Because it's kind of like the video is saying, if you want to love your emotions, part of that means getting to know your emotions, getting to realize what information they're trying to communicate to you and how to manage those things when they're there. And then as well, throughout emotion regulation, we're also going to be talking about just decreasing frequency of unwanted emotions, decreasing our emotional vulnerability to experiencing those emotions. So figuring out what's going on in our lives where those emotions maybe happen more and adjusting it from that perspective. And then the last goal is just decreasing emotional suffering. So again, suffering is really a choice that we make, whereas pain is kind of inevitable. Suffering is pain and non-acceptance. So noticing that we have to accept our emotions and, like the video is saying, love our emotions for them to really kind of manage themselves or get better or resolve themselves on their own. So emotions are always reactions to events around you or your thoughts and your feelings. And the thing about emotions is that they are so important in our lives. Our emotions gives us really important information about what's going on in our world. It gives us information about our context, how we want to react to our context. It's great for motivating and organizing action, communicating and influencing others, as well as just communicating to ourselves. If we didn't have any emotions at all, we would be pretty lost in the world. We wouldn't really know how we felt about anything. We wouldn't really have things that we wanted to go towards or things that we were running away from. We would stand still. It's kind of like what would happen is if we didn't have any stress in this world. We wouldn't really be super motivated to get off the couch and go and do things or explore hobbies. In the same way, our emotions are really helpful for guiding our behavior. And if we can get to know our emotions, then we can really understand where they are in that process and how it interacts with everything else. So every emotion has a function. There is something going on. There's a reason why we experience everything. Like thinking about evolution, if there was no reason to experience anger anymore, if that wasn't helpful for us anymore, evolution probably would have edited that out a while ago. But no, emotions are very intense and they're very salient in our worlds and our lives, which means they must be important. So if we're thinking about like the biological function behind why we have certain emotions, breaking it down really simply, fear alerts you to danger. Anger alerts you to a blocked goal. There's something in the way of something you need or something that you want. Sadness lets you know that there's something that you've lost. And it's helping you find a way to grieve that loss. And then guilt alerts you that you've acted against your values. If we didn't have any guilt and we did something that wasn't super in line with our goals or our values, we wouldn't necessarily have that internal cue telling us, oh, hey, we need to make up for this, or there's someone we need to make amends with, or whatever. So these emotions, even if they're not super fun to experience, have a really big purpose in our lives. So the way that mindfulness and emotion regulation kind of go together, again, referencing that video, is in order to regulate our emotions, first, we have to be able to, one, assess when our emotions fit the situation, assess which emotion we're feeling in the first place, and then assess whether or not our emotions in that moment are being effective and helpful, or whether or not our emotions are making things more difficult for us, if it's further blocking us from our goals. Because we need to know when to regulate our emotions. The goal of emotion regulation is not to get rid of them completely. It's really about making them work for you. Am I still doing this one? I am still doing this. Okay, so what good are our emotions? Just to go a little bit more in depth about what I was talking about earlier, emotions give us information. So emotions can signal that something is happening. It can be perceived as a gut instinct or intuition. And sometimes, unfortunately, since our brains are big survival machines, they work on shortcuts a little bit. So if your brain is thinking, oh, you're feeling afraid, your brain is thinking, oh, let's get you out of there. If you're feeling afraid, though, if any of you with the audience experience anxiety, you know that there's not always actual danger. Again, our emotions are maybe built up through evolution, and evolution hasn't quite caught up with the way our society is anymore. So thinking about what kinds of things will cue fear, your brain might not anticipate that right away, but your brain is really good at coming up with associations. So like a car horn honking, that will give you information about what's going on in your environment. And a lot of the time, either you'll get afraid or you'll have that panicky feeling and move out of the way before you even realize what's going on. So that is a great time when your brain needs to take that information as facts, right? It needs to just go really quickly. But what about like, if you're having a gut instinct that your teacher really hates you? That's not super helpful. And you might experience some of those same feelings, but just because your brain made that shortcut does not mean that just because you feel that way, that it's true. So noticing the ways that some emotions will spark automatic reactions and some ways that they do where it's unhelpful versus helpful. Moving right along, emotions communicate to and influence others. The the image that I chose to put on this slide are the 7 universal emotions, meaning that no matter where you are in the world, whatever culture you're in, whatever language you're in, if you are interacting with another person and they are experiencing this emotion, you will be able to recognize it on their face. That is what the 7 universal emotions are all about. And what that tells me is that these emotions are so important in our lives that we have to be able to recognize these things in other people. If that is biologically built into us, that we can recognize these specific emotions, whether or not they're part of our language or whether or not they're part of like we speak the same thing or a part of the same culture, tells us that like it's really important for communication. And if you've ever thought about like a time when you've just been sitting with someone like and talking to them, maybe about something that's really important to you, I'm willing to bet you've clued into their body language. And their body language gave you some really, really important information about whether or not you could tell that person was listening, whether or not they were distracted by something else, whether or not they're trustworthy, whether or not they hate what you're telling them. All of that is communication. And all of that, honestly, is based on the reaction that they're experiencing based on their emotions. Then lastly on here, emotions motivate us and prepare us for action. So like I was talking about earlier with the car horn beep, if something startles you, you automatically move out of the way because startle is not a great feeling. So thinking about the emotions that kind of make us feel alarmed or motivate us to do something that we need to do really quickly, that is also a really, really helpful way for us to navigate our environments.
One of the things I also think about too with emotions is sort of like they're a dashboard, right? So if you imagine a car and you have some things you always see when you're driving your car, right? Like you have your gas gauge, and you have your speedometer and things like that. And you kind of know what those all mean, similar to like some things you might be familiar with, like, right, gas, are you hungry? Things like that. But there are certain like alerts that will come on, like the check engine light or check oil light or like check tire light. And they're pretty not necessarily vague, like they're specific enough that oh, I need to do something with my oil, right? So if anger is a representation of like anger shows up if there's something that you haven't met your goals or like you're being blocked from your goals, it's similar to how like the check engine light comes on, but you don't know exactly what's kind of going on with the engine. Maybe like when the first time it goes on, you're like, oh man, I don't know what's going on with this. But then maybe through time or history or other patterns, you're like, oh yeah, when this thing happens, I do get angry. So I know that this is not being met or this is happening to me. But sometimes we don't really know until we investigate or figure that out. And that's kind of what we're doing and learning in this unit is thinking about, okay, what are these warning systems telling me? What is not matching up? And what do I need to do to figure out what's going on? That's kind of how I think about emotions is we have to explore and learn more, and we might not know exactly what's going on. But that's why we have to try to figure it out. But they tell us some things important, right? Because if I ignore my check engine light and just keep driving my car, eventually like some pretty bad things could happen and we don't want to do that. Or, like flat tire or something like that, depending. So that's kind of how I interpret a lot of what Kaylin just shared with us. So an emotion is a full system response that surprisingly only lasts about 60 to 90 seconds. So they did talk about it in that video that we just watched of when we acknowledge them and experience them, they actually go by quicker because we're saying, hey, this is here. Okay, cool. And we're figuring out how to move forward from it. So emotions seem to last longer than they actually do, but that's because our neurons are refiring in our brain and we feel it differently if we're sort of ignoring it because our brain is like, hello, I'm trying to get you to look at this thing. I'm trying to get you to think about this. You're not thinking about it. And makes it last longer. Whereas if we think about it, we're like, okay, what is it that this sadness is telling me? What is it my loneliness is telling me? Okay, I'm going to sit in this loneliness and see if I can kind of think through what it is and feel it versus ignoring it. But realistically, they only last about 60 to 90 seconds, which is not very long at all. It probably took me longer to explain it than it actually like in 60 to 90 seconds. So examining emotions. When we label our emotions, we're going to kind of go through this model that goes over a lot of different things. But when we examine our emotions and figure out what they are and why we're experiencing them, there's kind of a couple of different factors. So we have the prompting event. That can be something that is internal versus it's like a thought or a sensation that we experience. But oftentimes too, it's external. So something happens, somebody cuts me off in traffic, I get a failing grade on a test, whatever it might be. And then the other things to consider is my interpretation of the event. So somebody who cut me off in traffic, oh, they totally did that because they don't like me, or maybe it's the kind of car that I drive, or maybe they're on their way to the hospital and someone in the car is about to have a baby, or my failing grade is the teacher doesn't like me, or maybe it's I just didn't study. Then the biological changes that we experience when we have an emotion. So what are we thinking and feeling internally? How are then number 4 expressions? So how do we express that externally, which could be a bunch of different things, like our actions, our facial expressions. How do we communicate this out to the rest of the world, both unconsciously and consciously? I think there's elements of things that we do, like, if I choose to like throw something, that's pretty conscious, versus unconsciously, maybe I'm making a facial expression with my eyebrows or something like that. And then we have the after effects and the consequences. So based off of I experienced this emotion, I have thoughts, feelings, and actions around this emotion, and then there might be consequences or effects that happen to it. So if I have a failing test grade, that's probably going to impact my overall class grade. And then the consequences for that, whether it was, did I study, did I not study, did my parents have a reaction, does the teacher have a reaction, could be a variety of different things. So these are all factors that we consider, and some of these are very automatic. Oftentimes we don't think about how we respond to stuff. It's sort of that knee-jerk reaction. And that is one of the important things about DBT and learning new skills, is trying to kind of put a few more seconds in between our responses, right? So that we can do behaviors and act skillfully and do the things that we want to do. Because remember, there's no good coping skills and no bad coping skills. There's just coping skills that work and coping skills that maybe don't work the way we want them to, or don't work for us anymore. So the idea is being intentional, slowing down, using that mindfulness to figure out, okay, what is it that's actually happening? I'm upset, versus, so figuring out what is it actually that's going on. So if I say I'm upset, that can mean a variety of different things, versus I'm sad, worried, scared, angry, or frustrated. So again, figuring out our language and what's actually going on is really helpful. It's something that us therapists do all the time when we meet with clients. And we're like, oh, how are you today? Good, I'm fine, cool. Chat, 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 chat. And then we ask it again. Okay, so how are you really today? What's going on? And sometimes when I'm talking to my friends, I'm like, don't make me do the therapist thing and ask you again. Because,
True.
yeah, right. And like figuring out, and that's sometimes it takes, you have to figure out language, right? We don't have an automatic like thesaurus and understanding of what we are experiencing. And there's nuances to it, right? Like disgusted is very different than irritated, or like terrified is different than nervous. And the words that we have and the words that we use definitely have power. So figuring out what are we actually experiencing is really important.
All right.
So, yeah, you got this cool, awesome chart thing. So we're going to go through this each step of the way. Also, again, if you have your handout, we have this sort of on the last page of how you can go through this yourself with an activity or a prompting event that has happened to you. So the prompting event, like I had said, sets off the emotional process. It's something that could happen internally. So I could just experience a thought of like, oh man, I'm a piece of crap. But that could be my prompting event. Or it could also be like, my stomach is really, really upset and maybe I don't know why, and I'm not feeling well. But it also could be something that happens externally. So I could get an email from my boss, or I don't know, it could start raining. That could be another thing that externally could set me off. But that's what the prompting event is, number 1.
Are we switching off?
What was that?
Are we switching off, or do you want to?
I don't care. We can do whatever.
I was just going to say, like, with the vulnerability factors, I should have put this on the slide, but a very, very, very helpful image for this whole concept of vulnerability factors is a camel with like a full load of straw on its back. Have you ever seen that, Delaney?
Mm-hmm.
It's like wild, like it's like actually wild. And I think that sometimes is really helpful for people to understand, because vulnerability factors really refer to anything else that's going on in the context of your life that might contribute to this emotion coming up right then. And that's the example that I use for folks who like are told, oh, well, they thought I freaked out over nothing, or that was really actually a really, really small deal. Like that shouldn't have made me as mad as it did. And the thing is, I'm like, sure, maybe your prompting event was just one piece of straw, but has your camel got the load of straw already on its back? And that's where the saying comes from. Like, what is that final straw that really breaks the camel's back? there's a lot that a camel can take, but eventually it is the difference between one piece of straw or the other. There is a top net, like a ceiling for where, like how much of a load that camel can carry. So even if the prompting event is super, super, super small, there's a whole host of vulnerability factors that most people don't really consider when they're considering emotions.
And it's important to think about vulnerability factors, because it also can be really validating once you sit down and look at it, right? Like things that can have an impact on us emotionally is if we're tired, if we're hungry, if we just aren't feeling well, versus if we are like, we've eaten, we're well rested, we're generally healthy, and whatever that looks like for you. It could be other things too, like an anniversary of something that's happened, or just something that you just didn't even really sort of think about, but it could be impacting you and sort of adding all of this stress to it. Like I definitely know about myself that I get hangry. So that's something that I think about is one of my vulnerability factors. I think we'll talk about this a little bit later, but coping ahead. I always try to cope ahead with hunger. I always try to make sure I have like a protein bar or a snack in my car somehow, because I know that if I walk into something, it's going to be harder for me if I'm hungry. I also know that if I'm cold, I get really, really grumpy. Like I just don't like being cold. It's uncomfortable for me. So I try to plan accordingly, like having an extra jacket or things like that. But when you actually look at all the things that you might be managing, kind of like Kaylin said, somebody cutting me off in traffic is a pretty small thing to have happened. But if I'm also really stressed out about work and I'm worried I'm going to lose my job and I have a whole client caseload of kids that are having a hard time and I'm late for this meeting and all this other stuff, then of course I'm going to have an emotional reaction because I have all these other things going on. So thinking about vulnerabilities, even though the word vulnerabilities also might feel a little weird to folks, is really important and can be really validating to be like, yeah, I'm handling a lot right now. It makes sense, even though this thing felt really small or might seem small to other people.
Also, quick shout out to Brene Brown. Vulnerability is courage. So vulnerability is all good things, but yes, it doesn't feel so good a lot.
Yeah, all the time. Yeah. So the third part is thoughts about the event. So thoughts about the event are your interpretations of the event, or kind of like what pops into your head. So for example, if I am walking through the agency and Kaylin walks by me and I say, "Hey Kaylin, what's up? Hope you're doing well." And then Kaylin completely ignores me. And that's my prompting event. And my thoughts could be like, well, maybe Kaylin just didn't see me, or maybe Kaylin was busy, or maybe Kaylin had headphones in and she was on the phone, or maybe Kaylin is mad at me. Maybe Kaylin thinks I'm an idiot. Maybe I messed up. Oh no, what have I done? And that's when it's important to check to make sure are our thoughts accurate, because sometimes they're not. And also thinking about that dialectic, right? In multiple ways you can interpret a situation. It is not always black and white. It's a mixture of other things, and trying to think, okay, am I really interpreting this the way that I think I am? Because that will, my reaction to the situation of, oh no, Kaylin hates me, is going to be a very different reaction to, oh, maybe Kaylin was on the phone. Like those two thoughts are going to definitely set off a chain of events very differently.
Oh, yeah.
So 4 is things that are happening inside of the body. So things that are internal, so they cannot be seen by others. So what are things that you might experience, such as your heart beating faster, your temperature going up, your muscles tensing? Internally, we might have urges of we want to do this thing, we want to do this behavior, and it's just before we actually do it, because then that's part of the other thing of like what we actually do. So thinking about internal things inside of the body. What are we experiencing? What are we feeling? What are we sensing? Which could be a variety of different things. And usually there's commonalities with what emotion we experience and the sensations that we experience. Anger might feel a little bit different than sadness, although sadness, I have a coworker who always says that anger is sadness's bodyguard, so they might be connected in some way. It's of course always more complex and nuanced than just anger, sadness, fear. I have one client who likes to describe emotions as colors and sort of different shades of different colors. Like if anger is red, sometimes it feels like a different color or a different experience. Or if sadness is blue, then sometimes, you can have like a cooler red, and like, what does that sort of feel like or look like? And that's how they describe it, which I always think is really cool. So then outside of the body is going to be things that other people can observe or experience. So that's going to be our facial expressions, our posture, the words that we say, and the things that we do. So is it something like I throw something? Is it that I cross my arms? Is it that I furrow my brow? Is it that I also maybe like start yelling or swearing? Or is it the opposite where I kind of go really internal? Am I like kind of hugging myself? Am I in a corner? Am I saying things I wouldn't normally say? Am I apologizing a lot? What are other things that people might see that kind of also can give them cues of what we're experiencing? But what can they also give us cues for too? Like when, if I'm hangry and I snap at somebody, that's a cue for me of like, whoa, I don't normally snap at people. And I must be experiencing something here. And I should probably see if I can figure that out and check in with myself. So the consequences of the action of however we respond are, of course, going to be different depending on what it is that we're experiencing. But if we suppress the emotion, it can often lead to even more extreme emotions or a more larger reaction. I think a lot about how, if you ever go somewhere where there's like a glass in between you and the other person, like you go to the bank or like a movie theater, and there's science that shows that when that is in front of us as human beings, I actually used to work at a bank and we did not have the glass. And it was very interesting because the folks who do work in places with the glass, our immediate reaction as human beings is to talk louder because we think they can't hear us because there's something in the way. So instead of just walking up and being like, hey, what's up? We walk up and we're like, hey, what's up? I'd like to see Shrek at 4 p.m. today. And we automatically talk louder and we automatically escalate. And we actually have research that shows that the banks that have the glass in front of them, people tend to get escalated more and react more because they feel like the person on the other side isn't seeing them or hearing them or acknowledging them in the way that they want to. Versus if there is no glass, that doesn't happen and people don't get as escalated as quickly. So I like to think about that as our emotions too. Like if we put that piece of glass in between whatever it is we're trying to feel, or put that wall or that barrier or that boundary, and it's like, I'm not going to feel this sadness. I'm not going to feel it. Sadness on the other side of that is going to get louder and louder and louder until our brain is like, you need to acknowledge this. And then it will show up in ways we might not want it to show up, which then leads us to the last and final thing is the prompting event. However we react to it, there's going to be sort of consequences that then is going to lead to other things, right? So for example, my analogy, if I see Kaylin in the hallway and Kaylin doesn't acknowledge me, and my reaction then is like, I'm really upset. Like, I'm going to like send a nasty email to our team and just, next time I see something that's going on, I'm throwing Kaylin under the bus. Now that reaction is going to have consequences and it's going to have another prompting event, right? I might get in trouble with my boss. I might get into an argument with Kaylin. I might get fired. There could be a bunch of different things that could happen, but basically our actions have consequences. It always reminds me of, isn't there that one Vine where it's like, don't you understand have consequences? And I used to have—
That's so high pitched that the volume cut out for me.
Oh, good. That's so funny. That's how the Vine is. It's really high pitched. And I used to have a roommate in college that would say that to me. She'd get really high pitched and she'd be like, don't you understand that your actions have consequences? And that's sort of, again, the prompting event. So if we set ourselves up for a bigger prompting event, then like, of course, things are just going to keep escalating. But if we try to set ourselves up for like, okay, what are my actions? What are my consequences? What's going to happen here? We can then figure out how to be more skillful moving forward. Did I miss anything?
I just want to add a point in there too, that consequences is like kind of a strong word in this case. And really, like, I would prefer the word outcome for this, just because I think that better supports the idea that you can use this model for any emotion. It's not just the emotions that don't feel so good to feel. It's also the positive emotions like surprise, joy, happiness. Because the thing is, they will also follow this loop, depending on whatever actions or behaviors or expression you have. Once we get to step 5, that impacts the outcomes of those actions, the way anyone else is going to respond to you. And then that prompting event number 2 can further perpetuate that same emotion you're already experiencing, or that prompting event could really spark something completely new. So the other way that we use this in DBT is thinking about the areas that we have to change something or use a different skill. So like with vulnerability factors, we have skills for like, hey, let's lessen our stress in advance. Let's do some mindfulness. Let's figure out what you need. Let's use our please skills to take care of your physical body, as well as like obviously everything that we do with emotion regulation and distress tolerance is going to have its way inside the body and outside the body. And then emotion regulation really is about noticing, oh, hey, here's how everything fits in. And these are my different opportunities to make things change in a way that I would like better.
Also too, with the diagram, if we look at the circles, I think it's important to acknowledge that the circles can also feed off of each other as well, right?
Oh, yeah.
Like we'll do one thing and then that'll respond in another way, and then we'll feel this urge or we'll feel this action or we'll do this thing. Like I don't know if you've ever done something and you're like, damn, that felt good. And then you're like, I'm gonna do it again. And then it'll sort of, like create this sort of echo feedback that happens. So just wanting to acknowledge that too, of like, I think that's why there's the circles and why it sort of looks the way it looks, this model.
Yeah.
So let's use an example. I've used some throughout while we're talking about this, but let's lay it out for pretty specific ones. I think we're going to go through two, so anger and I believe joy. So prompting event is we have an important goal blocked or prevented. You or someone you love is attacked or disrespected, losing power, status, or respect, or not having things turn out as expected. So these are great prompting events that could spur anger, right? I'm sure we could look at that list and be like, yeah, that'd make me angry too. Vulnerabilities that could happen with anger: not sleeping, not eating, conflict with supportive relationships. So maybe you have somebody who's normally there for you and they're not available, or something's going on with them, or maybe you're arguing with that person. Feeling sick, or again, another example can be anniversaries of loss. Is it somebody has passed away? Was there a breakup, a divorce? Is it like also sometimes holidays will really be vulnerabilities for folks. Some holidays are harder than others. For folks for a variety of reasons. And then thoughts about the event that can prompt anger. So these are just kind of, again, themes to think about. Believing that you've been treated unfairly, blaming things, believing things should have been different. So again, shoulding all over yourself, rigidly thinking I'm right, judging the situation is wrong or unfair. Again, using some judgmental language can definitely impact anger and how we feel about a situation. Inside the body sensations that often accompany anger are muscles tightening, teeth clamping together, hands clenching, just, think of the Arthur fist meme, hot face, feeling like you might explode, unable to stop tears, wanting to hit something, bang on the wall, throw something. These are all pretty common when folks experience anger. One of the reasons why it's also important to kind of talk about what happens inside the body is sometimes we often don't know what emotion matches certain things. So there's the feelings wheel with it, which can be really helpful, but there's also a feelings and sensation wheel that also has some of these things that we experience with the emotion. So you can be like, yeah, I'm tired. I'm sleepy. What might that sensation partner with when it comes to emotions? What can be helpful, which is why we talk about this, because sometimes you can be like, oh yeah, my heart's racing, but I don't know what it is. It's always really interesting to be able to turn on that light bulb of like, oh yeah, when I am really excited, this happens. That makes sense. So that's one of the reasons why we talk about that too.
One thing that I noticed about the inside the body that I think we did forget to talk about in the actual diagram is the difference between like urges to do something. So the urge to want to hit, want to bang the wall, want to throw something, that is still going to be an internal experience if you don't then follow it through into action. And again, since this model is supposed to illuminate the areas where you can choose something different, I think taking a moment when you're in step 4 to recognize the urges that you're having and recognize that, hey, I have a choice to either act on these or not act on these. That is really important to count in your internal experience, because just because you feel like it doesn't mean you will. And I think oftentimes when we are navigating our urges is a lot of really, really skillful behavior. So, I mean, it's really important to recognize for yourself, I wanted to hit something and maybe I didn't. That's pretty awesome.
Yeah. So then the outside the body things with anger can be physically or verbally attacking, making aggressive gestures, swearing, stomping, slamming doors, walking out, criticizing or complaining, angry eyebrows, like what is our faces doing? What our how do we look to others? Is it that resting angry face, whatever it might be.
I was going to say that too, but that's a better way of saying it.
A resting angry face. Yeah. And then the consequences of anger, narrowing of your attention, like you're only focusing kind of on this one thing. Maybe there's other things that are actually going on, attending to only the situation that you're upset about and not being able to think about anything else. Or sometimes we totally check out. I know when I get angry, I totally check out. Like if I'm in a team meeting and something happens and it makes me angry, I'm like, well, I'm done. What's going on Instagram? Like I'm out, peace. But I know also too that anger is one of the harder emotions for me to sit with and acknowledge, because I don't like the sensations that come with it. And I know that about myself now. Whereas like sadness and I are good buddies. We can hang out all the time and it doesn't bother me.
Me too.
So another example we have is joy. So things that could be a prompting event, because it's also important too to talk about the good emotions, right? Because we can't, well, not the good emotions, because that is a judgment word. So I'm not going to say the good emotions. The thing is about emotions, there's some emotions we like to experience more than others, but we can't experience those emotions without also experiencing the emotions we might not want to have. Because again, if we're putting that like wall in between ourselves and our emotions, we're going to actually put the wall unintentionally between ourselves and all emotions. So if you're like, I don't want to hang out with anger and sadness, like good for you guys, you can hang out with anger and sadness. I only want to hang out with happiness and joy. Sorry, if you block out the other ones, you're really not going to be able to experience those ones or the ones that you want. It's just naturally your system isn't going to be able to do one without the other. It's kind of a balance thing. It's a dialectic. You can't have one without the other.
Well, I think it's really important to do the same work that we would with like anger, sadness, or grief that we would with joy, because finding out what is prompting that emotion and how we can keep it going is really important work that we can only do by analyzing it, asking it questions, getting to know it, learning to love it. So in the same way, if we want anger to happen less, we need to know the things that's going on with anger so we can make it happen less. If we want joy to happen more, we need to know what the things are that's going on with joy so we can try and make those things happen more too.
Exactly. So prompting events that can spark joy, to use Marie Kondo, receiving a wonderful surprise, reality exceeding expectations, getting what you want, something you were worried about that works out, being successful, receiving love or affection from somebody else. Vulnerabilities, again with joy, like what are the things that you did do that could help it, that helped impact this emotion? Was it that you did get enough sleep? Was it that you ate a really good meal? You don't really have a lot on your plate. You're feeling confident for whatever reason it is. You have the supports that you need. You have the tools that you need. Maybe it was you got to take a break. You got to go on vacation. What are some things that you can do or again, cope ahead for experiencing joy? Because like Kaylin said, it's important to know what causes that in our lives too, just as much as it's important to know what causes some of the other emotions. So thoughts, we didn't change the word. Thoughts about the events that prompted joy. So just like scribble that out. Thinking about a joyful event as it is without wanting to change anything. I know that when I work with teens and even as adults, sometimes when we're experiencing joy, there's this like feeling of like waiting for the other shoe to drop, like, oh, this is fake. This isn't actually going to last. And then we don't enjoy it when it's actually happening because we're thinking about what is going to happen when it's gone. So feelings inside the body, excited, energetic, giggling, laughing, feeling at peace, feeling calm, and the urge to keep doing whatever it is that might make you happy. Hopefully it's not like, you keep eating cake and then make yourself sick. But I mean, eating cake makes me happy to some extent. So, monitoring whatever that might be. And then outside of the body, so smiling, being bouncy, communicating your good feelings, silliness, hugging people, saying positive things, having an enthusiastic or excited voice tone. Those can be things that we can communicate with others that we are happy or excited or feeling joy. And then the consequences of joy, which just sounds so interesting.
Outcomes, I guess.
The outcomes of being joyful. We might be more friendly or more forgiving. We might go out of our way to do a nice thing, pass it on. Having a, let's see. Yeah,
having
so like
a high threshold for warrior. Yeah, it's weird. Grammar struggle.
Okay. That's okay. So, it allows us to, it sort of provides like a cushion, right? The consequences of it. Like we might be able to tolerate more that's going on in our lives. Like if I'm having a really great day and I get cut off in traffic, probably going to impact me less than if I'm having a really bad day and then I get cut off in traffic. So it kind of increases our tolerance for the other things that we might experience. And it also might remind us of other times that we were happy. There's our brains, again, like Kaylin was saying, are like these kind of supercomputers that help us in a way and recognize patterns. And sometimes they do recognize patterns for our favor, right? Like, oh man, I did this thing. That reminds me of that other time where I had this great, great experience. Or like, I went on vacation. That reminds me of this other vacation that I went on. I had this really great family dinner. It reminded me of these other family dinners that we had. And hopefully not the opposite of things that weren't so great.
All right, so for our at-home practice this week, I'm sure those of you who have been following along saw this coming, especially since we had the model and went through it twice. But we want you to identify an emotion that you've experienced over this last week or over the next week, whatever you want to do it, and use the DBT model of emotions to assess and describe the emotion. And again, it's this week more than ever, it's really, really helpful to have that handout. Again, that's posted on youtheastsideservices.org/toolbox. And you can scroll down, you'll see all of the handouts that we have. But in this handout, we have like little text boxes that are actually a lot easier to use in these small little boxes. So you can list more things or have multiple sentences or whatever works for you. And really just like practicing this, looking down and being like, okay, well, I'm actually just going to see what was going on with this emotion, good or bad. You can choose whatever you'd like, and just see how this goes for you. And then as well, for a kind of bonus at-home practice, if we're thinking about the functions of emotions, something that's really helpful is when we can challenge our myths about emotions too. So like the example that I have on the screen is there's a right way to feel in every situation. Maybe that's a bit of a blanket statement, but like I've definitely heard different variations of this thing. For example, like if you fail a test, I'm pretty sure you're expecting that most other people are going to react about the same way you do. But like, for example, if you get a C, it's a little bit more ambiguous. For some people, that is the cause of a celebration. For some people, that's going to make you cry. It really depends. But my challenge for that is that, like different people are going to react in very different ways and they're going to interpret situations differently. So they won't feel the same way in every situation. And this is just really helpful for like building self-compassion. And when you talk about yourself or when you talk to yourself about your emotions, you won't be perpetuating these myths that maybe aren't super helpful to believe. More examples on the handout. As well, Delaney and I wanted to remind y'all to continue to track your emotions and skills use. Finding a diary card, either you are welcome to reach out and ask for one that we use. There are many online on the interwebs. You can always just Google DBT diary card to find one. And again, just a reminder that this is super, super, super helpful for actually recognizing where you are using your skills and helping you track your moods. Because the other thing that will come out with that is how your mood and skill use kind of correlates together. And sometimes it's really helpful for demonstrating, oh, hey, these things really are super helpful for me to use. We do not currently have anyone joining us on the live right now, but just as a quick reminder, you guys are always welcome to join us in the future to ask questions about any past webinars that we've done or the one that we are presenting that day. But we will go ahead and move on for now. You are welcome to reach out to us. We do not currently have ability to take new clients, but that should be changing in the next several months or so. So feel free to keep checking back in with us and just seeing what we are doing with current clients or not. Once we are accepting clients, we are offering both virtual and in-person services, and that is the number that you can always call to inquire. You're welcome to follow us on any social media platforms you would like. If you'd like to reach out to someone else, the information about the crisis lines is always up on these slides. You can always follow those or call one of those numbers to get a hold of someone immediately. And thank you for joining us for week 9. Have a good night.
Thank you.